Okay, this next unit is all about quadrilaterals. A quadrilateral is a four-sided polygon, and there's going to be all sorts of different types of quadrilaterals. So we're going to talk about a kite, and a kite typically looks like this. Its best feature is probably the fact that it's got two consecutive pairs of congruent sides, so those are congruent and those are congruent. It also happens to have all sorts of other properties. The diagonals are perpendicular. It's got one pair of congruent opposite angles. Then we have trapezoids. Trapezoids have one pair of parallel sides, and really it's at least one pair. So a trapezoid could look like this, but this is also a trapezoid. This is also a trapezoid. This is also a trapezoid, and this is also a trapezoid because these just happen to have two. A trapezoid, the definition that Ohio uses is at least one. Now there are people in the world that just say a trapezoid is exactly one pair, but that's not what the Ohio Common Core has adapted, so we'll go with that. And then, of course, an isosceles trapezoid is similar to an isosceles triangle. An isosceles trapezoid is a trapezoid that also has congruent legs. So we have kites, typical trapezoids, even though all of these are really trapezoids, parallelograms, two sets of parallel sides, two sets of congruent sides, and all sorts of other properties, rectangles, squares, and then a rhombus. Those are kind of your typical. And again, if it's just a normal quadrilateral and not anything special, well, then it's just a four-sided polygon. Again, these are just the shapes that we're going to study in this unit. We'll start out with just having a general view of quadrilaterals, and then we'll look at parallelograms, and we'll look at rectangles and squares, then we'll look at trapezoids, and we'll look at kites, and we'll look at rhombi. So we'll go through all of them. And again, this sheet is up there for you to kind of look at, but I just wanted to introduce you to the different shapes. Okay. There is a sheet up there about polygons itself. Remember, a polygon, there's really two types of polygons. There are concave polygons and convex polygons. We're really looking at convex polygons, this type, where there's no cave in on itself. A concave polygon kind of bends in on itself. We will look at vertex, side, and diagonal. Those are words we'll use. Again, the polygon that we're studying in this unit, of course, is the quadrilateral. Right? Triangle, quadrilateral, pentagon, hexagon, heptagon, octagon, nonagon, decagon, unagon, dodecagon, all these things. And then just regular at n-gon. So we're going to be looking at a four-gon, a four-sided polygon. And that looks, those are just all quadrilaterals. So we're really just studying quadrilaterals here. And we're really only studying, convex quadrilaterals. But this is an example of a polygon. It does have, for us, it'll have four sides, it'll have four vertices, and then of course it'll have two different diagonals. Okay. Another PDF that's in your thing is a nice flow chart of quadrilaterals. And again, this is like a hierarchy, very similar to if you were in biology, you would start with like kingdoms and then families, and then all the way down to like the species of an animal, and all the different characteristics make it true. So a quadrilateral is here, and a quadrilateral is just, it's got four sides and it's got four interior angles. It's just a four-sided polygon. Okay. In this case, if you have two pairs of equal adjacent sides, well, then you become a kite. Okay. If you have one pair, at least one pair of opposite parallel sides, then you are a trapezoid. And then we get more specific. If you have two parallel sides, well, then you actually become a parallelogram. If you have two parallel sides and all your sides are congruent, well, then you become a rhombus as well, in addition to that. If you have the diagonals are congruent or all four angles are congruent, well, then you become a rectangle. And actually, if you meet both of these characteristics, then all the way down here, you become a square. And it works from the bottom to the top. I mean, if you're a square, then you, of course, are a rectangle. The square is the most specific thing. Squares have all the properties of a rectangle, right? All squares are rectangles. All rectangles are parallelograms. All parallelograms are trapezoids. All trapezoids are quadrilaterals. All rhombi are parallelograms. They're just very specific parallelograms. All rhombi are quadrilaterals. All squares are quadrilaterals. And so there's this hierarchy of properties. And the more the more down the list you go, the more specific the properties. Again, you can look at this one, and then I thought another really nice one that you could look at was this guy. This is our Venn diagram of quadrilaterals. Okay, so if you look at this entire circle is quadrilaterals. Anything living in here is a quadrilateral because everything living in here, kite, rhombi, square, rectangle, parallelogram, trapezoid, well, they're all quadrilaterals. Okay, if you live in this purple circle, which is the trapezoid circle, you must have at least one pair of opposite parallel sides, which is fine because all of these things have that. But to live in the green circle, you have to have additional properties. And the additional properties of a parallelogram would be you have two pairs of congruent sides. You have two pairs of parallel sides. You have congruent opposite angles. You have diagonals that bisect each other. These properties are true for parallelograms, but they're not true for trapezoids. Trapezoids just have one pair, at least one pair of opposite parallel sides. It could be two, okay? But then you have rectangles. Rectangles have all angles are congruent rather than just opposite angles are congruent. They have additional, well, opposite angles are congruent, but now all the angles are congruent and the diagonals are congruent. Where here, the diagonals are not congruent. You can see that in a general parallelogram, a parallelogram that is not a rectangle, the diagonals are not congruent, okay? In general, it's really hard to say things like, in a parallelogram, are diagonals congruent? Well, in a parallelogram like this, diagonals are congruent, but since a rectangle and a square are diagonals, and in their cases, the diagonals are congruent, then yeah, of course, there are some parallelograms where the diagonals are congruent, but that's not a general characteristic of all parallelograms. Generally, we want to describe something that is true for everything. Like all squares, the diagonals are congruent, the diagonals are perpendicular, the angles are congruent, all the sides are the same, so there's all these properties of a square. But again, if something is true for a parallelogram, then it's true for everything inside of the parallelogram thing. Again, the hierarchy goes quadrilateral is any four-sided polygon. Then there are specific quadrilaterals. I mean, there are just general quadrilaterals that are just four sides that live in this. They have nothing in particular. They have no angle relationships. They have no side relationships. They're just kind of random four-sided polygons, which is fine. But then there are kites. Then there are trapezoids. And again, I know we think most trapezoids look like this. Okay, and those are the trapezoids that are not parallelograms. And when we say the word trapezoid, we do typically mean things like this. But the definition of a trapezoid is at least one pair of opposite parallel sides. And so really then all of these guys are also trapezoids, which I know is confusing. There are people in the world that define trapezoid as just one, exactly one, and so it would be in its own little circle over here. But that's not what Ohio has adapted. Okay, so you can look at this. You can look at the flow chart, which gives a nice overview of these different shapes. Okay, you can look at just kind of the general picture of the ones that we're going to study. Okay, kites, trapezoids, specifically isosceles trapezoids, and again, we'll have a whole unit where we look at this. Parallelograms, rectangles, squares, and then rhombi, of course. Okay, and then there was this sheet where you're looking at the introduction of just kind of what a polygon is. So if I use words like sides or vertex or the diagonal, or if I happen to talk about something bigger in terms of this, you know, we'll do more advanced polygons later. But right now, this entire unit is really just about quadrilaterals. And all I want you to do today is download all those sheets and then study them up and see if you can get a handle on the different shapes and some of their properties. And then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go day by day. Hopefully you can see the assignments. We're gonna go day by day and we'll just, you know, like tomorrow, we're gonna study really specifically parallelograms. We'll probably spend 2 days on that. And then we'll do rectangles and squares, and then we'll do trapezoids, and then we'll do kites, and then we'll do rhombi. So we're really focused on the individual shapes and their properties and solving for things, and then we'll put it all together at the end. Okay, hopefully this got you kind of a good start to Unit 10, which is quadrilaterals.